Ophelia Cara is a 22-year-old harm reduction advocate living in Calgary, Alberta. She developed an opioid dependency as a teen after trying opioids for the first time while in the hospital and finally feeling happy for the first time in a while. She was formally diagnosed and now uses prescribed opioids as a form of harm reduction. She plans to get a doctorate in chemistry and pharmacology to dive into how drug use can be made safer. This is her story.
Okay, so for starters, can you tell us a little bit about your life before you started taking up your opioids?
Of course. My life was very, very difficult. My mom did the absolute best that she could for me to help me to make my life as easy as possible. Anything that I wanted, she bought it for me if she could. We were never rich, but she always did her best. And somehow, even though we didn't really have any money, she still found the ability to pay for field trips to Quebec and to pay for riding lessons. And I can't really point to anything specific in my up that would be that is a moment in my childhood that ruined me. For all I remember is that one of my earliest memories, when I was about 5 or 6 years old, my parents were still together at this point, so I couldn't have been older than 5 or 6, is just sitting in my room with my toys and just feeling this absolute wave of sadness and dread and misery wash over me and just wishing I wasn't alive. I was 5. I was way too young to be thinking things like that, and yet I was. As I came to find out later, that's because my brain doesn't release but growing up, that was my life. My mom doing the absolute best that she could to help me, not really knowing what was going on, and me swinging between these waves of absolute misery where I felt like I couldn't breathe, like I couldn't do anything, like I couldn't even stand up, to these waves of almost mania and excitement. But the only thing that I would feel like the impulse or the excitement to do was to kill myself. I started cutting from the age of 9. And you can also blur any of this out if it's too much. But my mental health was definitely a really, really tricky part throughout my life. And once again, it wasn't anything that my parents did. It was just something in my brain just wasn't working. I also didn't get along with my mom very well because of my poor mental health. I was living for the praise of others rather than for myself and what I found joy in and what I found a connection to. It was just really, really rough growing up, to be honest. I didn't even know what happiness actually felt like for the first 19 years of my life. I knew what obsession felt like. I would often latch on to certain things and then start doing them in the extreme, trying to compensate for that sadness, whether that was researching a bunch about reptiles, whether that was buying a bunch of books I would never read, candles I'd never burn, lingerie I'd never wear, just buying a bunch of anything or doing something over and over and over and over again, just latching on to anything. So I understood what obsession felt like. I understood what feeling scared to lose something felt like. A lot of my relationships before were me almost using someone as a substitute for medication. I didn't mean to use them, but I would depend on someone almost for my source of happiness, which wasn't healthy for any party involved. It was really, really, really rough growing up the way that I did. I didn't even understand what was wrong with me. I didn't understand why did I want to kill myself so badly. I didn't understand why did I have those waves of misery washing over me at random intervals when nothing was wrong. But the first 19 years of my life were definitely very, very, very hard.
So how did you get started on using the opioids, and what point in your life did you realize that you were addicted to them?
Well, it started a little bit after I went to the hospital for a sexual assault. There had been quite a bit of physical damage to my body. So as soon as the nurses took one look at me, they said, like, get her some painkillers, like she needs them. And that's when I had my first IV of Dilaudid. That was also the first time in my life that I ever felt happy and at peace and calm. But I didn't really give in to that feeling again and wanting that feeling again until the relationship that I had at the time, my first boyfriend, who I was very in love with, who 3 years later, I am still in love with him. I still have not gotten over him. That relationship ended. And I kind of felt like I was worthless without it. I kind of felt like I had worked so hard to make myself perfect for him. I had spent my grad with his friends instead of mine. I had helped his friends with their homework. I had spent more time with his family than my own. I waited to sleep with anyone until I never even kissed anyone before him. Like, I worked so hard to be the most pure, pristine, perfect girlfriend, like everything that you could ever want. I starved myself so that I'd have like a perfect body. I worked so hard to make sure that I was perfect for him. And when he broke up with me, I just felt worthless. So I tried to kill myself the night that he broke up with me, and I failed. And then that's when I started wanting to use opiates again. I started about 3 days after that because it wasn't so much about him breaking up with me. It was just about feeling like I was worthless. Like, I had tried so hard to be this happy, perfect person who wasn't scarred and damaged, and it still wasn't good enough. So I just felt like, what was the point in keeping myself, in this perfect way when all it does is hurt me? Like, I cried so much that I actually lost my voice. And I figured that since I just wanted to die because of how worthless I felt, opiates killed a lot of people. And I remembered what it was like from the hospital. So I thought that would be a good way to go. First, I started buying Dilaudid. No, first I started buying morphine on the street. Then I started buying Dilaudid. And then I started buying heroin, which was fentanyl. And another thing is that most people, when they start using opiates, they usually start with maybe snorting it, maybe smoking, swallowing pills. I went right to shooting right away. I didn't try swallowing. I never tried snorting, because in the hospital, that's how they'd given it to me, like in an IV injection. So that's what I'd learned. And I just went straight to that.
Okay, and what made you decide that you need to stop taking them? And if you don't mind, are you currently taking any opioids now?
This is where my story gets a little bit unconventional. And this is why I would like so much to contribute to this project. Because as I mentioned earlier, like, my life before I started using opiates was very, very hard due to that chemical imbalance in my brain. I'd also tried like classic antidepressants, everything doctors could think of to fix it, and nothing worked. But What I wasn't expecting when I started using opiates is that I was still in a lot of emotional pain, but eventually I stopped wanting to kill myself pretty quickly. I was still in a lot of pain, but I didn't want to die anymore. For a while, my addiction to fentanyl was the only thing that was keeping me alive. I also ended up in an abusive relationship at this period because I was very vulnerable after losing my first love, and kind of powered through it because of how difficult it was at times. With saying this, I would like to add that I would never, ever, ever recommend using street drugs to anybody ever, because some things that they don't tell you about opiate use is that, first of all, you will throw up a lot. And throwing up when you're on opiates is a very, very unpleasant experience. It's very hard to learn how to do it properly. It's not just overdoses that can kill you with opiate use. For example, one common thing is endocarditis, where if you don't clean your supplies properly, if you don't use sterile supplies every single time, you can actually get an infection in the linings of your heart, and that can kill you really quickly. There is a lot of ways that street drug use can kill you, either while you're still doing it or later when you don't even want to die anymore. It's not just addiction that you have to be careful about. It's not just being dependent on the substance. If you don't know how you are doing, what you are doing, it's a really, really dangerous thing to do. And if anyone ever sees this, just remember, if you ever, ever, ever get into using drugs, I hope that no one who's watching this ever will. But if you ever get into using drugs, research harm reduction if you can't quit. Quitting is the best. Sobriety is the safest way to go. But if for whatever reason you can't do that, either right now or ever, please research harm reduction. It might save your life. With that being said, it did keep me alive during all of those horrible experiences. And once I had come out onto the other side, I tried my hardest to get sober, to stop using. Had about 4 months with no drug use whatsoever. But the problem was that while I was using opiates, I actually felt happiness. I actually understood what happiness felt like. And in the 4 months that I was not on anything, the waves of misery came back, the suicidal impulses came back, all of the horrible mental urges and intrusive thoughts and mental struggles from my chemical imbalance came back, because the opiates were compensating for that chemical imbalance, but without it, nothing was compensating for it. And it was almost worse, because when I didn't know what happiness felt like, it was one thing, but now that I knew, it was a million times harder. I went to go see a doctor after I had been sober for 4 months, after I was off of Suboxone, off of methadone, everything. And the doctor tried a lot of different things to help me. Nothing did. A lot of things just made it worse. So eventually, as a last resort, she put me onto Dilaudid, which was, if you remember, what I'd been taking right after morphine. But along with having the prescription for Dilaudid, which is still an opiate, I'm also in therapy. I meet with my doctor regularly, and my mindset around how I take my prescription has completely shifted, if that makes sense. So the opiates still compensate for the chemical imbalance, but I'm no longer using any street drugs whatsoever. I don't even smoke weed. I rarely drink because I have no need to. Now I'm actually happy in my own right now that I have a small enough dose of opiates to compensate for the chemical imbalance, but to still leave me able to function and live my life in a normal way where I'm not constantly out of it. And that's an example of harm reduction. That's why I mentioned harm reduction. For me, getting completely sober was not feasible. It would have led to me dying eventually, either of a relapse or of suicide or something of the like. But this way, I'm at least able to live a normal life where I care about my job. I'm closer with my mom. I care about my fully lucky to be alive. I've really fallen in love with living, which I know sounds very cheesy, but for once I'm living for myself because it makes me happy, not because I don't know a way out. While street drugs were a very, very dark time in my life, and I wouldn't recommend them to anyone, they were a stepping stone to getting to where I am now, because I didn't know that it was possible for me to enjoy so many different things, for me to draw passion from so many different things, for me to have healthy relationships with people where I'm not kind of using them in place of medication. I'm really, really lucky that I managed to find a doctor who was willing to work with me for what I need and try something really, really unconventional as an absolute last resort.
Looking back, was there anything that you would have done differently?
I would have researched harm reduction a lot sooner. Getting into it, I didn't know anything about how I could keep myself safe. I would have researched harm reduction so much sooner, because harm reduction, it can either be something that you do while you are getting ready to get sober, which would be ideal, or it can be something that you do to keep yourself alive if either right now or long-term sobriety doesn't feel right for you. And again, I would recommend never doing drugs in the first place, because once you feel it, you can't unfeel it in a sense. But if that's not avoidable, if anyone ever gets into drugs, the biggest thing I would recommend for them is to research harm reduction specific to whatever substance it is that they are doing, whatever way that they are taking it, because it's very, very, very easy to die from doing drugs, whether that's from related infections, whether that's from overdoses, whether that's from so many different things. It's very, very easy to die from doing especially street drugs. And harm reduction can be the thing that makes the difference between you having the chance to recover when you're ready and you not having that chance. So that's what I would have done differently: research harm reduction a lot sooner.
And what kind of advice do you have for youth regarding opioids?
The advice that I would have is, I need to think about this for a second.
Yeah, it's okay.
I guess it's never too early to ask for help, which sounds really, really cliche, but it doesn't matter whether you've been using opiates for a month, whether you've been using them for 5 years. It's never too early or too late to ask for help. There's no such thing as addicted enough or struggling enough. If you feel like maybe you're tempted to try opiates, maybe like what happened to me, you have them in the hospital one time and then you remember that feeling when you're struggling later. There's no such thing as too early to ask for help, because opiates are something that they can be very, very helpful for medical purposes if they're used properly by a doctor, whether that's as a painkiller in the hospital, whether that's for my prescription, My prescription has given me my life back. But the drugs that you find on the street are not that. The drugs that you find on the street are 1,000 times more powerful, and you have no idea how much you're really taking. You'll have to constantly take more. You'll deal with a lot of horrible withdrawals, with throwing up, with a bunch of infections, with so many horrible, horrible things. And it's not worth it to get into street drugs because they always take more from you than they give. Even if you're considering trying them, even that's an indicator that there is something that you really need help with. And there's no shame in admitting that. If I had admitted that sooner, if I had learned healthy coping mechanisms from the time that I was a child, instead of pretending that I didn't need help, maybe I wouldn't have started doing this. And maybe I wouldn't be as stable as I am now, or maybe I would be, I don't know. But if you learn healthy coping mechanisms, and if you feel at all like I did, if you relate to my story at all about not really knowing what it feels like to be happy, it is not normal. I tried to lie to myself and say that it was, but drug use is a symptom of something greater needing attention. It's a symptom, not a cause. Most people who are completely happy, who have good coping skills, good support groups, most people in those situations will not use drugs. Some of them will if they lose their jobs, if they lose their houses, but it is always a symptom. So if you feel at all like you need some help, there's no shame in admitting that. Absolutely no shame whatsoever.
Since filming this, Ophelia has filed a lawsuit against the province of Alberta under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to put a halt to the new opioid restrictions. The new restrictions require service providers to refrain from prescribing opioids for at-home use unless approved by a medical director. She has been granted an exemption so she can continue to access the treatment she requires. This injunction will remain in effect until the lawsuit against Alberta's new standard is resolved in court.